China militarily and technologically advanced much faster than even they expected.
China has its reasons to drift away from the dollar. The US is considering China to be an existential threat.
China is aligned with the Gulf's ambitions, and the US's use of sanctions has pushed a coalition of the unwilling. The world will bifurcate and will have one sphere and the other sphere, each with their reserve currency or dominant currency. No country wants to choose, but they will be pushed to choose under the new Trump administration.
I do not see the benefit of an active military involvement.
We see the probability of some sort of conflict over Taiwan is 70%. I mean, of course, I'm watching everything.
Hello and welcome to Capital Horizons, the podcast where money meets politics. I'm Igor Yelnik. Our guest today
is Diana Choyleva, founder of Enodo Economics. Hello, Diana. Thank you very much for joining me.
Hi, Igor. Very nice to be here today.
You have recently published an impressive report on the shift from the petrodollar system towards the digital yuan system. China has its reasons to drift away from the dollar. The US is considering China to be a rival, almost an existential threat. And it would be naive to believe that China will want to remain dependent on the US currency. But one thing is to want to do something, and a different thing altogether is to actually do it, while nearly half of China's international trade and financial transactions are conducted in dollars. Nevertheless, it follows from your report that the key question is not whether the transformation is taking place, but rather its pace and scope. Tell us, please, what are the forces driving this evolution?
Look, this report looks at specifically the petrodollar system. And the reason for that is that the trade in oil accounts for 1/5 of the global trade in dollars. And so if there is a change in that system for whatever reason, this will have a huge impact on the status of the dollar as a reserve currency. In my career as a China analyst for over 25 years now, I've looked obviously continuously at the issue of China trying to internationalize the RMB. They have a revamped, coherent, multi-pronged strategy that they implemented in the last few years, which sort of really put to the side their early experience between 2009 and now. And this is another report that looks in more depth, in particular this nexus of China, the Gulf, and the US, and will we have a transition from a petrodollar to a petroyuan? Is that feasible? Is it likely to happen? And over what sort of time frame? The conclusion here is that the three key factors to look at really are technological advancements, that through using digital currencies for cross-border payments, you can achieve a tremendous transformation, improvement in efficiency and cost of cross-border flows, which is sort of a really due a revamp. And China is ahead of the game in developing digital currencies and in experimenting and being ready with a system for using those for cross-border payments. It's also its relationship with the Gulf. There is now an alignment. Of course, China has been or has turned into the Gulf's major consumer of oil a while back, and they currently are. But where it's more interesting is that China is aligned with the Gulf's ambitions for economic transformation. The way the Gulf looks to technology and diversification of its economy to achieve its long-term economic and geopolitical ambitions. And that ties in with both China's capabilities, but also their willingness to work with the Gulf in helping them further those ambitions. And last but not least, of course, is the issue of the position of the US and how they have interacted with not just China, but the Gulf in particular. The US's use of sanctions more broadly post the invasion of Ukraine, and how that has pushed a kind of group of, we call them a coalition of the unwilling, a group of countries that are all looking to how to diversify their exposure to US dollars. And by the way, that also refers to not just using the US dollars, but using the US dollar-based global payments system.
Yes, that's very interesting that in the beginning you mentioned that we're speaking about the petrodollar system. Can you briefly explain what this petrodollar system means and how the petroyuan system will work?
So the petrodollar has been a feature of the global financial system for 5 decades, and it was instrumental and continues to be instrumental in allowing the US to have not just the economic influence that it has over the global financial system, but also the geopolitical influence in terms of how it could use the primacy of the dollar. Now, it's important to distinguish 3 elements of this petrodollar system. Essentially, you have the pricing of oil in dollars. You have the payment of oil in dollars using US dollar-based payment rails, and you have the recycling of the oil revenues into US dollar assets. Now, our investigation uncovered that actually of those 3 elements, it's the settlement and the recycling function that are already changing and likely to change the most, while the pricing of oil in dollars is unlikely to change during the forecast sort of horizon that we looked at, which is the next 5 years.
The US securities market is very deep and very liquid and very well developed, and people trust the US legal system. So this recycling of the US dollars back into the US economy, basically lending money back to the US, both on the corporate and on the governmental level, is like a very easy thing, and everybody knows how to do it. And the Gulf countries have been doing it for a long time. With China, it's already different. The legal system is questionable, to say the least. The capital controls are still there, so it's unclear how to get your money out of China, even if you are allowed to invest there. So I'm just not seeing the basis for competition.
Yes, so you're absolutely right that the depth and the breadth and the trust of US capital markets is a key advantage of the dollar and the US system. One which we advise US policymakers should focus on in fostering further. When you look at Saudi Arabia, they are having a very difficult choice. When the petrodollar was conceived, if you'd like, both their economics and their geopolitics were with the US. Now the story is different. The geopolitics remain with the US. They rely on the US for security guarantees. But the economics have shifted towards China. So already they are really in a difficult position in terms of how to move forward, trying to satisfy both the sort of US demands and Chinese aspirations and opportunities that the Chinese give them. For starters also, a lot of those surpluses that the Gulf countries or Saudi ended up with were often at a time where their economies had very little more than just oil trade, the oil trade. And now they're trying to significantly diversify. So these surpluses are likely to be less and being sort of recycled through more the trade route and the route through which they are much more tied to China in terms of their not just oil but non-oil trade as well. So quite outside of the issue of capital controls, we argue about this sort of closed loop dynamic that China is pushing, not just with the Gulf, but more generally with the Belt and Road countries, where they, in the case of the Gulf, use the oil revenues to purchase machinery, equipment, to build facilities, manufacturing facilities in Saudi that are, or in other BRI countries that are producing the goods that then China consumes, pays for in yuan, and you create this closed loop of yuan use. But China is also opening up its financial markets. It provides a diversification opportunity, even if you, let's say, have a different view as to, or you think that the US assets are going to outperform, you have the need to diversify and not put all your eggs in one basket, especially not when all of your trade is no longer so deeply tied with the US economy. So China offers that. And the big roadblock, if you'd like, are the capital controls. Now, here, first of all, we have from our investigations, there seem to be some sort of specific guarantees that China is offering Saudi Arabia. We were not able to uncover what they are, but Saudi policymakers have referred publicly to these arrangements. Also, here is where the innovation in global payments using digital currencies comes into play. Because to use digital currencies or distributed ledger technology to improve global payments introduces also the ability to see much more concretely where these payments are going. You attach certain contracts to them, and you are able to track these payments. So outside of the issue of them introducing, sort of, you use cross-border payment using digital technology, you end up with the payment being made almost instantaneously within seconds, which sometimes takes 2 to 3 days going through the corresponding banking system. And as such, it is in cost and efficiency extremely attractive. But in addition to that, the capability of being able to track this adds the kind of security that the authoritarian or sort of command top-down regimes would value. And this is now an optionality that the Saudis have opened themselves to. They're very careful in how they balance their relationship with China and the US, and we don't see them, a wholesale or a very fast switch from using dollars to using yuan, but we see the gradual sort of erosion of the role of the dollar as a payment currency in the trade of oil between the Gulf. We've already seen, of course, for geopolitical reasons, the erosion of an almost complete stoppage of the use of the dollar when it comes to Russia and Iran. So already about 20% or so of the trade in oil is not in dollars. But the Gulf really is the linchpin. If there is significant transformation there, you will have a much wider impact. From one point of view, luckily for the US, this is not the base case that we see. It will be a careful sort of optionality, doing some of those payments using the Chinese payment rails, using the yuan, maybe originally starting much more for the non-oil trade, and then maybe some for the oil trade, much more investment or recycling channel through the China's economy with its, with using the yuan. But because of the world we live in, actually the second most likely scenario is the one which is a significant disruption. And that significant disruption could be geopolitical, conflict over Taiwan, could be technological, China making some leap, in particular in the production of advanced semiconductors or in quantum computing or something that puts it in a much sort of in a lead position and makes it more attractive for an economy like Saudi Arabia. Could be political upheaval. It could be sort of a an economic collapse, financial market. But all of those scenarios that before the era of the great decoupling, you would have put probably last as an outside, as a sort of outsized or an event that is unlikely to happen but would have an outsized outcome. Now this is our second most likely case.
I have so many questions about what you have just said. Let's start with the fact that the digital yuan is going to be issued by the People's Bank of China, which means that every transaction which happens in the digital yuan is going to be controlled by the Chinese government. I'm not sure that there will be so many takers of this beyond China.
So the Chinese currency is, the digital yuan is very much sort of a digital version of the yuan. And with the digital aspect of it and the centralized aspect of it, that then the Chinese do have the visibility and the control. However, when they have been building the use of digital currencies for cross-border transactions, they have tried to have a system where each individual central bank that participates into this maintains its control over its information. Now, the main project that is now in commercially viable stage is the so-called mBridge. And with mBridge, this was...
mBridge is the system which was developed together with the Bank of International Settlements, right?
Yes. And as you know, the Bank of International Settlements pulled out in October of 2024. So mBridge stands for Multiple Central Bank Digital Currency Bridge. It's actually an initiative that had its genesis with the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, Bank of Thailand, their experimentation. Meanwhile, the UAE and Saudi were experimenting with this in their own way. Then the UAE joined the HKMA, Bank of Thailand. The PBOC also became part of this, and it was under the umbrella of the BIS Innovation Hub. So what this means now with the mBridge being, the BIS pulling out of it, on the one hand, it has been presented by the BIS that they did so because mBridge now doesn't need them. It's reached commercially viable stage, so, it can operate on its own. And on the other hand, we've had them make the comment that it is not sort of ready for rollout. It's not as advanced as some might sort of expect. So there's a bit of contradiction there. Are they letting it go because it can stand on its own feet or not? But certainly in our investigation, it seems that mBridge is a lot more advanced as a mechanism that then is sort of publicly, not publicly known, but that people are aware of. Now that the BS is out of it, and this is because the issue has become so politicized, and it's another indication that the world will bifurcate ultimately into two spheres of influence, an American one and a Chinese one. And again, we can chat separately why I think it will bifurcate and not have a multipolar system. And within that, with the BAS coming out of it, this is much more really turning into a China-led initiative. And it remains to be seen how they will organize themselves legally as well as operationally in terms of the standards. But it is not, just talking about the advantages of the US financial system and its openness, etc., etc. There's clearly countries in the world that for this, that value this. But there's also countries around the world that are looking to carve out, they would like to ideally carve out their own sphere of influence, but I don't think that's possible because they, only China and the US are at the forefront of technological development in all areas. No one is anywhere near them to be able to offer a sort of a third pole. And so those countries have, shown by words and actions that they are interested into in a different system. So it is no longer, I would say, for the sort of US Western-led world enough to just espouse the values of their system, because on the other side of the equation, there are other people who do not look to those values. And they will have a hard time sort of figuring out where they ultimately want to end up. It's fair to say that no country or really big multinational wants to have to choose, but they will increasingly be pushed to choose, not least under the new Trump administration.
Yes, and this brings us back to the question about the careful trading by the Saudis and by the other Gulf countries, and we have already seen that the Saudis have postponed their full membership in BRICS. Is it by chance? Is it related somehow?
Absolutely, yes. It is related, and it will be very interesting to see how this unfolds. The Saudis have tread a very careful line. They've sort of been on board with China-led initiatives globally, but they've always kind of shied away a full endorsement. Having said that, they did join Enbridge, and they're creating at the moment optionality. And their strategic calculus will be shaped by a range of factors, one of which will be sort of the continued belief in the unconditional security support that the US provides. Now, we've just been listening to the confirmation hearings in the US of the various Trump administration candidates, and you get a very clear sense that geopolitically the focus will be on the Indo-Pacific to really the diminution of US interest in the Middle East and in Europe. Whether that turns out to be the reality, we'll have to see whether that is the right strategy in terms of maintaining the US's even Indo-Pacific position remains to be seen. But these are the type of considerations that will weigh heavily on the Saudi administration.
Okay, speaking about it from the economic perspective, we know that China runs a huge trade surplus. With Gulf countries, it's a bit more nuanced. Their exports and imports are, the balance of payments with Gulf countries is strongly dependent on the price of oil, which is quite volatile. Since the goal is probably to create an alternative to the dollar as a world reserve currency, I think we're facing some interesting situation here because the US clearly runs a significant trade deficit, And if you want your currency to be a world reserve currency, you need to run a deficit. And China obviously doesn't, and it doesn't run as even with the Gulf countries. Do you think that there may be some positive feedback loop, like if the digital yuan or any other form of yuan is adopted, then it will lead to a trade deficit by itself?
No, the causation has to be the other way around, if you see what I mean. At the moment, it is not, but what you have seen is the decline of the size of the trade surplus that China has with Saudi Arabia. And the idea that China has here, because they realize this and they have been talking about turning their economy from sort of the processing kind of manufacturing hub into the consumer of last resort of their sphere of influence. They do realize that they have to be in that position within their sphere of influence. And again, opening a bracket here, I don't think it's sort of even any more so apt to talk about which will be the dominant global reserve currency. Because what I expect is that the world will bifurcate and will have one sphere and the other sphere, and with each with their reserve currency or dominant currency. And then the aim of the game here is to see which sphere will be bigger than the other, will they be in equal size, etc., rather than who will be a dominant currency globally. That sort of paradigm, I think we've shifted away from this, and we are firmly into this decoupled sort of way of thinking. So now within that, China's vision is that it exports of production within its sphere of influence of goods and services that then are sold back to China. So that trade flow is part. Now we can argue, are they likely to be able to achieve it or not? That's a different question. But the realization that they have to be this sort of consumer of last resort within their geopolitical sphere of influence is certainly there. And already the BRI initiative, which originally followed the strategy of investing into building infrastructure in the BRI, has shifted in the last few years to building out industrial capacity to enable that flow of, first, if you're not a Gulf country, for example, you can borrow in yuan, buy the machines and sort of tools you need to build out that capacity in your country to then produce the goods that you'll be selling to China, which will then be paying you in yuan that you can then use to pay down your debt. So it's this kind of closed loop of yuan use that actually, from an industrial perspective, doesn't need at all capital account openness. And it shifts part of this activity, obviously, away, or shifts this activity away from dollars.
The relationships between China and its neighbors are not necessarily brilliant, and some of them are quite tense. And it's not by chance that some of Chinese neighbors are forging their ties with the US. The obvious way to expand the use of your currency is by trade with your neighbors. Here, China is facing some problems. I'm not sure that Vietnam, for example, will want to switch to the yuan rather than to continue to trade with the dollar.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Geopolitically, China is in an area where, it will be extremely unlikely that Japan falls into the Chinese sphere of influence.
Yeah, Japan is a very good example.
Or Korea, although the Korean story is probably more nuanced than the Japanese. We just had Indonesia, though, join the BRI. And in Southeast Asia, there is a lot more buy-in. But all these countries are where this contest between China and the US will play out. We have analyzed these developments for a number of years, and we have our views on which countries are likely to end up in which sphere of influence, and what are the factors that are going to determine this. And it's fair to say that the situation is a lot more uncertain with respect to which countries the US will be able to retain as its sort of as part of its sphere of influence than it was sort of 5 years ago, 8 years ago. But no, absolutely, China is finding itself in a difficult geographical spot, which it has issues on all fronts. I mean, its relationship with India is not the best. India has its own ambitions and visions, even though it is very it sort of espouses being non-aligned. And it looks like Russia and China are cooperating. They're not really in a traditional alliance, but they're really working together. However, when it comes to unresolved territorial disputes, China has one with Russia. So how strong is that relationship, especially now that Russia has been put very much in a vassal position to China? That relationship was always imbalanced, but now it is even more imbalanced. There is the story with North Korea, South Korea, another very difficult one, not least because of Russian influence in North Korea, which is really, a very direct Chinese issue. So the situation is very complex, and within that complexity, there is this huge sort of gravitational pull of these forces at play, and a clear desire by a number of countries to use the agency that they now got in playing off both sides, which before they didn't have, to achieve their own idiosyncratic goals, which also creates a lot more uncertainty and geopolitical flashpoints, where neither the US is any longer prepared to be the global policeman and provider of security everywhere in the world and can't really do it either. And China is not prepared and not willing to step in. So this is a very unstable situation, one that is trying to find an equilibrium, and I don't see that possible really on a sort of even a 5-year horizon. And throughout that time, I think it will be complacent to just sort of put all our belief in the transparency and depth and breadth of US capital markets, which is the biggest attraction in this. Because when it comes to, let's say, certainly the efficiency of global trade, or indeed where the manufacturing capabilities are, that's certainly China's domain.
Yeah, indeed. I'm not sure I would agree with you with regards to the Chinese relations with Russia. Not completely agree, because as far as I remember, please correct me if I'm wrong, there was a little military conflict between Russia and China in 1971 or around that time, and after that, the dispute was resolved, and Russia and China have an agreement which basically says that there are no territorial disputes. And it was somewhere in the middle of 2024 when the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs made a statement saying that there are no territorial disputes with China. But I would certainly agree with you that Russia is firmly...
Just for the record, number one, I'm not Russian, I'm Bulgarian. But number two, I'm not necessarily an expert in sort of the relationships between China and Russia. But my understanding is that this is an issue that has not been resolved. But also, to be honest, in the context of Trump's normalization of territorial claims that the US has even less reason to claim. You really, I think, should question that sort of type of world we are going into and who can claim what on what grounds. So I would kind of, have have my eye on this relationship and how it unfolds, and it's not so one-sided, or it's not so mutually symbiotic as some may think.
Yeah, here I certainly agree with you. And in the 1950s and 60s, the relationship between the Soviet Union and China was brilliant, as you know. They were closest of all friends. And then it cooled down towards the end of the 60s, the beginning of the 70s. As I said, there was even a military conflict between the countries. So we've already seen these countries falling apart. This is especially interesting in the wake of the new policies by the Trump's administration. And from the Trump's administration perspective, it's quite clear that the biggest problem is China. It's not Russia. Therefore, they will probably try to reverse the implications of the Ukrainian conflict, which firmly pushed Russia in the hands of China. As you said, it's absolutely not natural for Russia to be close friends with China. Russia is a European country by nature. Most of the Russian population lives in Europe, not in the Asian part of the country. And therefore, if there is some kind of resolution of the Ukrainian conflict, if there is some kind of resolution of the sanctions imposed on Russia, it may start to shift away from China, which will probably bring some problems to China.
I'm more skeptical about such a scenario, not least because the Ukraine-Russia conflict is existential for Europe, which is, an ally of the US. And so I'm not so certain that there is a quick resolution to the Ukraine conflict under a Trump administration. And simultaneously, I'm also not so convinced that Russia will countenance some sort of switch of sides. There is potentially a scenario where if the US pulls out of that conflict, then Europe and China could potentially reach some sort of agreement, but that again is very difficult to imagine given the different systems, such a sort of fundamental alignment. So I would say that it's for the US trying to put a wedge between Russia and China in the same way as Nixon did with his engagement policy is not really a viable option.
Okay, we'll see. I believe they will probably try. I'm not sure they will succeed, but they will try. Speaking about geopolitical issues, since we are now in this corner, people are so concerned about China potentially attacking Taiwan. Do you believe this is a realistic possibility?
I mean, it's not a question of belief, but of, careful assessment of the factors that come into play to make a decision on the probabilities of conflict. And my team has deep experience, and we do have a separate service that has looked iteratively day in, day out at this issue for the past 4 years, starting sort of this dedicated effort. Of course, a lot of the expertise way predates this service. But we are in a position where we could make these type of assessments, and very few people who talk about these issues are actually in that position. And so I can tell you that over sort of the long term, on a 3 to 5 year horizon, we see the probability of some sort of conflict over Taiwan between China and the US, or over the South China Sea more broadly, is 70%. And so that is likely. We
Why?
also, a confluence of factors. For China, it's absolutely an issue, and the Communist Party an existential issue to unify with Taiwan. That's an unfinished business. There is, I mean, if you think that the Chinese Communist Party can turn to its population and say, oh, we wanted to unify, but they don't want to, so now let's just change, then of course there's no conversation to be had. But everything that the Communist Party has done since this unfinished business of Taiwan is to work towards a unification. And a lot of that effort was originally sort of on the carrot approach, or rather than the stick approach, and on the expectation that they will be able to do this peacefully. But a number of things have happened in the world that have made this now less likely. One, the Taiwanese are not up for it, and even more so after what happened with Hong Kong, which was in some ways the model of how this Taiwan-China unification could work. So that model's out of the picture. But also importantly, this has become now a dynamic between China and the US. Neither China nor the US want to go to war over this, but both are actively preparing for one. And this, if nothing else, it certainly has increased the likelihood of an accident happening. And as we don't have proper crisis management communication between China and the US, or indeed between China and Taiwan, and not only that, but even if you had, the Chinese tend not to pick up the phone for days until the issue is escalated all the way to the top, the likelihood of an accident happening has certainly increased significantly over the last few years. And we do assess the likelihood also of all types of scenario in terms of sort of what could constitute military action, and what could fly under the radar as gray zone activity, and how far pushing these gray zone activities China is willing to do, wants to do, what the strategies are. But to ignore this issue will be a huge mistake, because it is the fundamental risk from, the most important risk from a geopolitical point of view in the world. And even if you focus on it from the perspective that the focus of the two countries on this issue is kind of allowing all these other geopolitical flashpoints that we have seen. But that's kind of extending the story further.
Okay, it's interesting. I'm certainly not in such a good position as yourself to make an assessment of this matter, and I certainly agree that a conflict may happen by accident. There is no question about that. But in terms of intentions, I do not see the benefit of an active military involvement in this issue for China. They have had this Taiwan issue for 75 years, and they can probably wait another 25 or 50. Nothing will happen. They can keep telling the same story.
That might have been the case before Xi Jinping, but it's no longer the case. There's a few things that happened that changed the calculus. Number one is the fact that China militarily and technologically advanced much faster than even they expected, certainly not, faster than the world expected. So they are in a position now where they could, whereas for most of those 75 years, they couldn't, even if they wanted to. So now they can. Again, if you play out the scenarios, including the involvement of the US and allies, it's less clear that they will prevail. But if allies and the US don't participate, then they most likely will overwhelm Taiwan. Now, it's a huge risk for the Communist Party. It's a decision they will not take lightly. And certainly from a short-term perspective, we don't expect, the probability of an actual invasion or an act of war or something they do that we constitute in an act of war is low. But that I wouldn't say that they would wait 25 years. Now, the other two reasons for this is Xi Jinping himself. He, everything we have studied and know about him, but also not just what he says, but what he does, suggests that he wants to be the leader that unifies Taiwan and enters China's history books. So this is really very much a personal aspiration and ambition that is probably a guiding motivation. But the third and even, force that basically takes the issue out of the decision making of China or out of China's hands is the efforts the US is making into ensuring that they deter China. So China, in that sense, is running out of time. It doesn't have 20 or 50 years to be waiting on this because the US is now laser focused on building up deterrence in the area to ensure that this optionality is very costly for China.
I certainly hear your arguments, and they're very valid.
And I mean, sadly, so, this is one forecast I'd really, really like to be wrong on, but ultimately war is not a logical decision.
No.
The motivations tend to sort of make very perverse sense or make sense to those who initiate these actions on different types of motivations that you can just ascribe kind of an everyday person's logic to it, that of course that will be a bad outcome.
Indeed. In another matter which I would like to circle back to is where we started. The digital yuan, China pretending to take some part in the global financial system, trying to make yuan a world reserve currency, not the world reserve currency at this point. Put any number on it. Let's say the yuan taking 30% of world reserves. How many years, in your opinion, are we talking about?
We've not done this type of estimate, not least because when we looked at the petrodollar issue and everything around that issue, that obviously is one part of the calculus. It's not the only calculus on what the expectation is for the yuan share of international reserves. So I can't put a number on it, but I want to make a qualification to saying that really the use of digital currency for cross-border payments is now on the cusp. It is not yet, it is not yet sort of gathered critical mass to be a major already factor, but it has the potential to be. So now is the right time to sort of think how to deal with it. The report we published was with the sort of goal of giving advice to US policymakers specifically. So that was kind of the task. Of course, there's loads that one could talk about this in terms of what are the forecasts, because what you say should happen doesn't necessarily mean will happen. But the report was not meant to say what is likely to happen, but what policymakers should do to prevent it from happening, if you see what I mean. But I think it's also very important to, I tend to struggle with the reserve currency, the use of that term all the time when you're describing three different aspects as well: the medium of exchange, the store of value, and the unit of account. And you could still have the US be the dominant currency in reserves, but have a lot of the payment function, medium of exchange, move to the yuan or other currencies. And I would say that the most resilient aspect of this is the pricing. This is where the freedom and open information and all of that of the US markets really has the strength. Moving the pricing away will be the most difficult aspect of this. But both the foreign exchange or the store of value aspect already has happened with nothing to do with China. There's been a move away from the dollar for diversification purposes and across a sort of a smaller group of countries than kind of, you know, the Japanese or the British reserve assets. So that's already happening. And the payment is where the Chinese are the most concerned with, because they want to ensure that in the scenario where there is a particular conflict for whatever reason between China and the US, they can basically source what they need from the rest of the world using their own currency and using their payment systems. So they're not dependent existentially on the US dollar-based payment system. So more generally, I would be sort of much more watching that. I mean, of course, I'm watching everything, but that is where you are likely to, see, and where it's consequential to see how this will change, because it will invariably also impact the cost of doing business in dollars, because the dollar is also so efficient and less costly because it has this deep market. But if more of the trade is not done in dollars, then obviously that will impact the cost. And of course, if China then goes for these technological solutions that are so efficient and so cost effective, and the US shies away from investigating the use of digital currency for cross-border payments, and by the way, here again, opening a bracket, because our advice is to use that, is for the US to investigate that use, not as the current administration is saying, we will not sort of develop central bank digital currencies. There's absolutely no need for the US to develop a central bank digital currency for the use domestically, for example, but use or indeed just it can use the technology benefits of the distributed ledger technology and shape it as they would like it to. I mean, of course, that's another bigger discussion about centralized versus non-centralized, etc., etc.
Indeed.
But what I want to make the point of is that the use of central bank digital currencies for cross-border payments doesn't have to go with the use of digital currency domestically.
Yep, understood. Thank you very much, Diana. This has been a very interesting conversation. I learned a lot. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Igor. It was my pleasure.
Thanks for listening. This has been Capital Horizons.
So if you would like to see or learn more about Capital Horizons, please subscribe below.
From Michael and I, see you next time.